Today, I'd like to continue our journey through the book of Judges, that amazing book about the different leaders that were very helpful to the Jewish people in battling against the Canaanites and giving them some sense of solidarity as a people, or some sense of unity. We're in the seventh chapter of the book of Judges, and it's the famous story of Gideon. And Gideon, at this point in the story, at the kind of midway point through chapter 7, Gideon is given the rather unusual uh, demand from God that he reduce the number of soldiers in his army. Usually, when we're fighting a battle, we want to get as many soldiers together as possible. But in this story, Gideon is told to reduce the number of soldiers he has. And at this point, he's down to 10,000 men from 22,000. Uh, but God says, 10,000 is still too much. So Gideon is wanting too much. So God told Gideon, well, lead the soldiers down to the water. I'm going to do this little experiment. So very interestingly, Gideon, being very faithful to God, follows what God wants, leads the soldiers down to the water. And God told Gideon to separate the soldiers there into two groups. Those who would lap up the water with their tongues, uh, similar to dogs, and those who would kneel down to drink. So here we have these two groups of soldiers. And he says to one, you can be part of the group that laps up the water with your tongues, or you can be part of the group that kneels down. So only 300 decide to lap up the water with their tongues. The rest do the more conventional thing, of course, they kneel down. Nobody wants to bend down and lap up the water, and that's kind of crazy. So God tells Gideon, well, what we're going to do now is the real army that you're going to do this battle with are going to be the ones, the 300 who lap up the water. Well, what about the other 900, 9,700? We're just going to let them go home. So this is kind of a strange thing that God is talking about. But Gideon again remains faithful to God. Now, in thinking about that, as you analyze it, there really is a reasoning, I think, behind this, the distinction here. So those who lapped up the water would always be ready to fight because they would be upright and they would be able to withstand the enemy. So those who chose that path, they're really thinking more like when a battle comes, we got to be ready. And so it's really a good thing they're prepared. Those who kneel down, on the other hand, they had to place their arms on the ground, and with their arms on the ground, they wouldn't be able to really fight. They're kneeling down. It would have taken them longer to get into the fight and to get ready. Well, those who lapped up the water, they're upright, their arms are free, they're ready to go and to fight. So the force now is reduced to 300. Another strategy here, too. A force of 300 would probably be a better force for fighting at night. They would be able to hide more, be less obtrusive, be less known. So there's two aspects to the strategy here. Certainly those who lapped up the water, they're ready. They can fight. But also the reduced number is going to be better for this operation that Gideon is going to be involved with, because it's going to be a nighttime surprise attack on the enemy when they're sleeping, when they're not ready, when they're not prepared. Always good, of course, to catch your foe off guard. And this is what the strategy seems to be here. So God then tells Gideon, and here we see in the whole scheme of things here that in every step of the way, God is leading Gideon, and Gideon is responsive to God. And really, what is it saying about us? It's saying that it's very important to be open to God's call and God's way. We might have wanted to do things in a different way. We might have wanted to take more men. We wanted to maybe taken those who knelt down. That might have been a better strategy, we would think. But if we listen to God, sometimes God gives us a different strategy. That is not our preferred strategy. That's not the way we want to do things. But we're trying to listen to God in our lives, right? We're trying to take some time and say, well, what does God want me to do? So we notice here a sense of prayerfulness on the part of Gideon. He's in dialogue with God, which is what prayer is, of course, talking to God, conversation with God, listening to God, being silent with God, being open to God, contemplating God. All of those are certainly aspects of prayer. And this seems to be Gideon's approach. It's a prayerful approach. He's in dialogue with God, he's listening to God, and finally, and most importantly, he's following what God wants him to do. So God then tells Gideon, go down to the camp of the Midianites so that he could overcome any fear that he might have. And God knows, Gideon, you're afraid in this situation, you're outnumbered, it's difficult. It's actually 3 tribes together, Midianites, one of the 3. So it's going to be a difficult situation. So naturally, anybody would be apprehensive, and certainly Gideon is. So Gideon goes down to the camp of the Midianites, and he overheard a dream that some of the Midianites were having. And the dream was about a round barley loaf that would roll into the camp of the Midianites and turn some of the tents upside down. So that was the dream, this round barley loaf. So Gideon, of course, reflects on that dream, and he realizes what that dream really means. The round barley loaf symbolized the agricultural aspect of the Israelites. The fact that they were now settled on the land, they weren't roaming, they weren't migrating, they were more settled, and as a more settled group, they developed their agriculture, and so they would produce the barley. And the tent, it's rolling into the tent. Well, the tent would refer to the Midianites, because the Midianites were more nomadic. They would move from place to place with their tents. So here is the settled group, the Israelites, with that round barley loaf, rolling into the tents and upending the tents. Gideon hears that dream, and it's a beautiful sign for him that we are going to do well in this battle. It reassures him, it calms down his fears. So God sent him to the Midianites for that purpose, to help him become less afraid.